as we mentioned earlier in the program, the Republican tax bill that's currently being floated is a cornucopia for the wealthy and not so much for a lot of other people. And here to flesh that out for us now is Michael Hiltzik. Michael's been on the program before. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He writes a column on business and economics for the Los Angeles Times, and he is the author of a number of books, quite interesting books. And first of all, Mike, welcome back to the program.
It's good to be back with you.
And secondly, we've seen a couple different versions of the Republican tax bill surface, but you wrote a piece a few days ago, and the headline was, the GOP tax plan is filled with petty cruelties aimed at the vulnerable and the middle class. Here's a list. And it may have had a slight iterative change or two since then, but that is basically still true, right?
Oh, yes. The basics haven't changed much. The major petty cruelties, it's sort of an oxymoron, they're all still in there. They are all aimed at the middle class. Some are bigger deals than others, but you put it all together, and this is essentially an arrow aimed at the heart of the middle class.
Now, before we get into the particulars of some of the reasons that it is, let's just talk for a second about the politics of it. Why would any political party, granted, you and I both know the middle class is shrinking rapidly in this country, but why would any political party put together a tax bill that only benefits the few when we are supposed to be governed by the majority?
Well, that's a good question, and it's sort of a metaphysical question, I think. We have to look into the souls of the people who are putting these monstrosities together, but I think certainly on the face of it, the pressure to do this is coming from the wealthy, and it's coming from wealthy donors. That's really what this is. This is all about. The Republican donor class has made it clear to their cat's paws in Congress that they have to get this done if they want donations. So they are doing it, and what they're trying to do is sort of rebrand this tax cut for the wealthy as a tax cut for everybody, including the middle class. They've now had, 4 or 5, maybe 6 outside analyses and a couple of inside analyses, including from the Joint Committee on taxation, that tell them that this is really going to hurt the middle class, moderate income families, lower income families, and it's going to be a boon to the 1%, and especially a boon to the 0.1%.
So in other words, they're trying to sell it as something it isn't. Now, I've had a couple of political discussions in the last several days, and particularly since the election, the Democrats' victories. It seems to me that, and again, I mean, we're here to talk business and economics, but the politics is somehow inseparable. Maybe I'm naively optimistic, but it seems to me that if the bill were passed in its present form, it would hurt Republicans politically.
Well, I would think so, and I would think that given the results of the election on Tuesday, you will have a lot of Republican members of Congress really sort of panicking. We talk about moderate income and lower income people, but one of the segments of the population that's really going to be hurt by a lot of this are sort of upper moderate income suburban families, and especially in big states, not just California and New York and New Jersey, but Illinois, Pennsylvania, Maryland, many states across the heartland, where people do actually take a lot of these deductions out of that the Republicans want to wipe out. So I think a smart Republican will look at this and say, we need to rewrite this thing, and we need to do it quick, because the longer it's out there, the more people are going to understand how much it hurts them.
Yeah, well, that's what I would think too, unless the lure of campaign cash is just too much to resist. But let's talk about some of these landmines or petty cruelties. The education assistance, the idea that tax deduction for interest on student loans would be eliminated. This is first of all, I think the latest figure, 44 million Americans are paying off student loans. It's a total approaching or at about $1.5 trillion owed on student loans. As you point out, more than 12 million people took advantage of this tax break. How much revenue are they getting from this, and is it really worth the political pain that doing this might inflict on them, not to mention the pain it's going to cause a lot of households?
Well, it's in the great scheme of things, it's trivial in terms of the revenue it'll produce for the Treasury. But I think you really want to put all of these measures for higher education together, and it's stunning the scale of the attack. I mean, first of all, as you said, it's going to eliminate tax deductions for interest on student loans. More than 12 million Americans took advantage of that tax deduction in the last year we know of, which is 2015. Then there's a tax break for tuition. There's a tax break for graduate students who are brought into graduate programs as teaching assistants. They tend to get their tuition waived, basically to pay them to be teaching assistants and to allow them to continue their studies. That waiver would become taxable under this bill. That's thousands of dollars for many students who don't have any money. A tax credit, the lifetime learning credit, which allows a deduction of 20% of the first $10,000 of education expenses per year. That would cut an average family's tax bill by up to $2,000. That's going to be repealed. This is all just crazy. It's just, as one Democratic congressman said, referring to in another context, this is cartoonishly malevolent, and it's malevolence aimed at young people trying to get their education in colleges and universities. Well, if you want to dip down a little bit further at K to 12, school teachers who reach into their own pockets for classroom supplies, they're going to lose their deduction. It's nuts.
Before we dip down a little further, though, I just want to add that that this seems, if you just take the higher education piece of it and tie it together, what you seem to have is an assault on higher education. And I wonder whether it isn't because there's this hostility, this notion that they're all hotbeds of liberalism and Antifa and political correctness, and I wonder if there's an ideology behind it. Well,
if you apply Occam's razor, which is, look for the simplest explanation, I think you don't even have to go there. Basically, this is just looking for pennies and dimes in the cushions, and looking for them, taking it from segments of the population that don't have a strong political voice because they don't have money. You can lather on the idea that, they figure that universities, are against them, but you don't even have to. Basically, this is an attack on the vulnerable.
Yeah, and again, we're talking with Michael Hiltzik, columnist for the Los Angeles Times, about the petty cruelties, if you will, in the in the Republican tax bill. Teachers, as you were just saying, teachers lose their deduction for classroom supplies. In other words, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but if you're a corporation making billions of dollars by moving jobs overseas or doing other things that may not be in the greater interest, you get to keep your tax deductions. In fact, you get an enormous tax cut. But if you're a teacher barely scraping by because teachers don't make money and the school doesn't have enough budget for supplies, and we all know that teachers do put money out of pocket for those classroom supplies, and a deduction, $250, tiny deduction, they take it away, right?
That's right. And what's interesting about that is that this is an above-the-line deduction. In other words, you don't even have to be itemizing deductions to take that. It is really, any teacher who, is a qualified teacher, and on average, school teachers in the United States spend about $500 out of their pockets for pencils, for books in their classrooms, for construction paper, for stuff like that. They get to write off $250 of that each, and these guys want to take that away. Go figure.
Yeah, go figure is right. And no more deduction for medical expenses, which is really a deduction that I've used it once when there was a major surgery in the household. Now they want to take that away, right?
Yeah, this is a really important provision. This is a really important repeal. It's so important that although I listed it among this roster of petty deductions, petty repeals, I did a subsequent column looking at this deduction alone. Look, the fact of the matter is, a lot of middle-class families have to take this. You can only take it if you are itemizing deductions and your medical expenses exceed 10% of your adjusted gross income, which is your income after, various other reductions. But this is the difference between being able to basically husband your resources when you are sick or hurt and facing poverty. The families who take this are almost entirely middle class. They're families whose insurance doesn't cover all of their expenses. They might have, as you said, major surgery. They might have a family member with a chronic illness. It could be cystic fibrosis. It could be muscular dystrophy or multiple sclerosis. These are conditions that, first of all, reduce your ability to make a gainful wage. They're incredibly expensive, not only drugs and treatments and surgeries, but also in many of these conditions you need 12 or 24-hour home care that's almost never covered by insurance. And the only way that you can pay for that and make ends meet and keep body and soul together is by relying on this deduction. It can be worth $15,000 or $20,000 that you could write off. That can be $4,000 or $5,000, $6,000 in terms of your tax break. It is really just unbelievably cruel to try to take this away. It directly targets some of the most vulnerable Americans, some of your most vulnerable neighbors. They're people who have catastrophic medical expenses, with chronic diseases, with disabled children, spouses, or parents, and dwindling nest eggs. This is, you cannot really overestimate the cruelty of taking this away.
Yeah, it goes from petty cruelty to really something horrifying.
Really monstrous, absolutely monstrous.
Yeah, and it's basically saying we're going to, I try to be objective sometimes, at least in the analytical phase, but it seems to be saying we're going to protect our rich friends and take care of them, and we're going to do it, among other things, by abusing the sick, the wounded, and the disabled. that it's just...
Yeah, and by the way, as we said, you have to sort of breach a threshold of 10% of your income. The figures from the IRS tell us that wealthy families don't really use this deduction very much, and I think that's for two reasons. One is that their incomes are so high that 10% is a significant threshold to meet before you can start deducting. But the other reason is most of them tend to have very good insurance, and that means that they don't have a lot of out-of-pocket expenses that aren't covered by insurance. So you look at the IRS figures, this deduction really is concentrated among families earning less than about $75,000 or $100,000 a year. And that's, that is really not a lot of money if you've got a sizable family.
So, and maybe you put your finger on it, Mike, maybe the reason why they're targeting this particular deduction is because rich people don't use it very often. Who knows? As you say, who can look into their souls? But, we're going to run out of time, but we haven't even begun to touch the list. There's still plenty more there. Adoption and parenting for the party that claims to stand for family values, make it tougher for people to form families and raise kids. Property and casualty losses for people who have suffered the tragedies of natural disasters and other forms of disasters, and any number of other cruelties. Of course, electric cars, renewable energy, all that's in their targets. So we've used every, I don't know what else these guys could do to be, in your words, more cartoonishly villainous, except maybe tie little Nell to the railroad track. But do you have any closing thoughts on this?
Well, I think my closing thought is that, the more average Americans learn about the details of this bill, the angrier they will get, and they're going to know where to direct their anger, because the Democrats certainly aren't going to buy into any of this. There's just no rationale for it. All of the analyses we have seen from the Joint Committee on Taxation, from the Tax Foundation, from the Tax Policy Center tell us that this will have no real impact on the economy. They're not going to get economic growth out of this thing. All they are going to do is upstream middle class, moderate income, lower income resources to the wealthy who don't need any more. And that's basically all of these deduction repeals are going to go to fund enormous tax cuts, such as the elimination of the estate tax, the reduction of pass-through income rates, the ability to continue to avoid and evade capital gains taxes. It's really just awful. It's infuriating, and I think the voters will. They've shown already that they're not buying into a lot of this, and they're going to show it more.
Yeah, well, from your lips, as they say, to God's ears. So, Michael Hiltzik of the Los Angeles Times, thanks for the great reporting and analysis on all of this, and keep up the good work, and thanks for coming on the program and explaining it to us.
All right, thanks for inviting me.